When Australia was established, yeah, sure, it was a pretty brutal settlement. My forefather and foremothers were on the first and second fleets. It was a pretty brutal place, but there was no slavery in Australia.
That was Prime Minister Scott Morrison speaking recently on 2GB radio. His comments really infuriated people around the country because they were so blatantly untrue. He was actually forced to apologise for what he said 2 days later.
I don't intend to get into the history wars. My comments were not intended to give offence, and if they did, I deeply regret that and apologise for that.
Australia does have a brutal history of slavery. It's a history that really didn't end all that long ago, and it's one that leads to a continuum of violence that's acted out against Indigenous communities. The Prime Minister's comments highlight how Australians, including those in power, are still willing to skate over this history, when really we should be trying to understand it more because of the continued harm it's doing to these communities. And a warning for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander audience, this episode is going to contain images of deceased persons. This story starts in the 1860s. The US were in the middle of a civil war over their use of slaves, and because of that, industries in Britain were drying up. And that's where we stepped in. Australian farmers decided that they wanted to fill that gap. But to do that, they needed manpower. So they resorted to using slavery, Indigenous workers and workers from the South Sea Islands. State laws allowed for both. At the time, government statutes around the country allowed employers on sugarcane farms, cattle stations, and in the pearling industry to take on as many Indigenous workers as they wanted. Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and the NT were the biggest users of this practice. Basically because there weren't enough white workers there to sustain industries. Indigenous people were stolen away from communities and effectively owned by their employers, who treated them like property and controlled every aspect of their lives. Employers decided what they wore, where they travelled, who they married, and eventually what would happen to their children. Indigenous workers were even sometimes branded with tattoos to show that they belonged to their employers for the rest of their lives. And tens of thousands of Indigenous people lived this way, even into the 1950s and 60s. Professor Talia Anthony is an expert who specialises in criminal law and Indigenous justice issues. And she told me that this Indigenous slave labour and exploitation is what Australia's current wealth has been built on.
Big corporations, especially over in Britain, were able to reap the rewards of their labour, while Aboriginal people were left completely destitute and still, weren't able to build any inheritance to pass on, weren't able to create opportunities for their children, and is still suffering from that legacy.
Besides Australia's exploitation of Indigenous people, people from the South Islands were also picked up and forced into work, something that came to be known as blackbirding. State governments allowed for 3-year contracts where people from Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and Fiji could come to Australia to work for a minimal amount of pay for 3 years. Blackbirding ships started visiting islands to pick up islanders in 1863. And even though it's not written in official records, there are countless community accounts that people were actually kidnapped from their families to be taken to Australia. Over 62,000 South Sea Islanders ended up working in Australia. Because they were so abused, overworked, and left to diseases, around 30% of these workers ended up dying here. And the money they supposedly accumulated never reached their families back home. After Australia became a federation in 1901, these workers were just turfed out of the country and deported back to their homes. So, why doesn't Australia have a broad recognition of our history of slavery? Why is it that Prime Ministers past and present have openly denied what happened to Indigenous communities and South Sea Islanders on our land? Associate Professor Emma Christopher is an expert in the history of South Sea Islander slavery, and she told me that when it comes to blackbirding, it's been easy for Australia to forget.
Almost all of them are deported. Because they are not white enough for white Australia, which is why it's not in our news. It's why we don't have people, it's not all the reason, but it's a large part of the reason that we don't have, people on the streets as much protesting this. as happens in the US, for example, because most of their customers got deported. All these ideas that we don't have a racism problem in Australia, well, we're not made to face it.
Professor Anthony told me that while we've been reminded of the violence that's now seen against Indigenous people in state institutions, Australia has to remember that that kind of violence also existed in the past in our industries.
But we can't forget the violence of colonisation in terms of how businesses were able to profit from Aboriginal people.
Imelda Davis is the chair of the Australian South Sea Islander Association, and she really wants to set the record straight about her community's history in Australia. Her grandfather was taken from his home when he was 12 years old, and she's been lobbying the government for a long time to establish a representative organisation to work with the government and address the effects of generational trauma that was caused by the blackbirding practice.
Don't think because you're not South Sea, you're not First Nations, you can't come in, or don't be fearful. Don't attach fear to this voice of truth that's happening for the country, for our globe, for the world. Don't be fearful, because at the end of the day, we're human beings, we all bleed red. And it's just about greater understanding for each other.
Not only did slavery absolutely exist in Australia, multiple communities were affected, even into periods that are still in living memory. And continuing to skate over the facts and ignoring this history as a country is only going to continue doing damage to the descendants of those tens of thousands of people.